the weight of the crown yard standing in the blistering sun, somewhere between Thebes and eternity. The desert stretches out before you, but behind you lies the beating heart of an empire, the Nile River. It snakes lazily through the sand, feeding crops and people alike. And you, the Pharaoh, are supposed to control it all. But no one told you how heavy the crown would feel, not just the gold and lapis on your head, but the expectations, the rituals, the burdens. From the outside, being Pharaoh looks like a dream. Palaces, gold, absolute power, and adoration. But once you're inside the role, it's endless. An Egyptian pharaoh wasn't just a ruler, he was a god on earth. And that made things difficult. Gods, after all, aren't allowed to have bad days. The divine CEO was born to rule, but not in the way modern monarchs are born into luxury. The ancient Egyptian court was an unforgiving place. Even as a child, you were treated less like a boy and more like a symbol spoken to with reverence, but never truly known. Your tutors trained you in military tactics and religious doctrine. You were taught how to read hieroglyphs, but not how to understand your own heart. Every decision you made would need to align with Ma'at, the Egyptian principle of cosmic order and justice. A pharaoh's job wasn't to innovate, it was to maintain stability, legacy, faith. You didn't lead armies, you maintained the harmony between the gods and the land. If crops failed, you were blamed. If the Nile didn't flood properly, it was your failure. If the gods were angry, it was your responsibility to appease them. With rituals so tedious and exact that a missed syllable might spell doom. You weren't a king, you were quality control for the universe. Too many priests, too little privacy at any given time. A pharaoh could be surrounded by priests, advising, observing, correcting. The high priests of Amun-Ra and Osiris wielded immense power and had their own political agendas. You had to balance their demands without angering the temples, which held land, wealth, and influence. You may think you'd wake up in the morning and stretch your arms over polished stone floors, greeted by peace. In truth, the morning began with ritual purification. You were bathed and anointed, not out of luxury, but because your body was a sacred vessel. You couldn't just eat breakfast. First offerings had to be made to the gods. Your food had to be blessed. And even then, it might be cold by the time protocol allowed you to eat it. The priests didn't just tell you what the gods said. They interpreted your dreams, dictated your schedule, and managed how you interacted with the afterlife. You were supposed to be immortal, but that meant spending much of your life preparing for death. Death planning from day one, from the moment you took the throne. Your tomb was your side project. You may have imagined overseeing kingdoms and leading military conquests, but the truth was far more sedentary and administrative. Your architects would present you with options for tomb layouts. Should your pyramid have 45 or 60-degree angles? How much space do you want for afterlife provisions? You'd spend years approving blueprints for your burial chamber. You supervised the creation of canopic jars, coffin inscriptions, magical amulets, and food offerings. All of it had to be perfect. Eternity is a long time to live with a design mistake. And then there were the workers, hundreds of stonecutters, masons, and artists, all of whom needed food, shelter, and supervision. You were the project manager of a multi-decade construction effort, whose deadline was your own death, family, enemies, and pretenders. Even within your palace walls, you were never truly safe. You had dozens of wives and concubines, each vying for position. Sons who might one day inherit your crown, or take it from you early, ambitious generals, envious scribes, schemers in linen robes. Succession in ancient Egypt wasn't as clear-cut as it might seem. Sometimes the son of a lesser wife could become pharaoh. Other times, the high priest might install a puppet ruler. You had to watch everyone, smile politely, while scanning for betrayal, and all the while, your enemies outside the palace waded Nubians to the south, Hittites to the north, bandits along trade routes. You had to send armies, but you didn't just wage war, you had to write letters, plan supply routes, and ensure there was enough grain in your own storehouses. What good was a conquest if the capital starved while you were gone? The burden of perfection is Pharaoh. Your face was carved into stone across the land. Temples bore your name. Decrees went out in your voice. But you weren't allowed to be human. Could you show sadness? Not really. Doubt? Never. You had to uphold Marat, always appearing serene and godlike, even as you worried about crumbling granaries, missed omens, or your nephew's suspicious friendship with the Vizier. And in the quiet hours, when the incense smoke drifted through the halls and the scribes had stopped writing, maybe you sat on a cool stone bench and thought, was any of this yours? Did anyone love you, or just the idea of you? The desert night is creeping in now, and even a pharaoh needs rest. But what exactly did ancient Egyptian rulers do when they weren't giving orders or overseeing tombs? Were there hobbies, secret escapes, or odd rituals that broke up the monotony of power? Evening fell over Thebes, or Memphis, or whichever city. The court had taken residence in that season, and with it came a different kind of ceremony. You might think a pharaoh could retreat to private chambers, enjoy a quiet meal, maybe listen to music or relax. But that wasn't quite how the life of a living god worked. There was a tight schedule of rituals and appearances to maintain. The setting sun wasn't just the end of the day, was Ra descending into the underworld. And as pharaoh, you played a part in helping him get there safely. No, really. There were ceremonies, chants, offerings, all timed to the fading of light. You didn't go off duty. The gods didn't punch clocks, and neither could you. There was no real privacy, not in the way you'd understand it today. Wherever you went, a string of attendants followed. There were bodyguards, advisors, scribes, and priests. You were never truly alone. In the rare moments of solitude, there was still the weight of memory, of expectations, of ancestors watching you through long dead eyes. Your every move was meant to uphold not just your legacy, but that of every pharaoh before you. A misstep could offend the gods, or worse, your predecessors. Of course, not every pharaoh was devout. Some were political operators who did the minimum required to keep the priesthoods content. But even then, the machinery of divine kingship was inescapable. The rituals didn't stop. The state needed them. Your legitimacy wasn't just military or dynastic, it was spiritual. If you skipped a sacred rite, and then the Nile failed to flood, the people might think the gods had abandoned you. And if the gods abandoned you, the people could do the same. One of the most exhausting parts of your role, perhaps even more than the religious obligations, was the bureaucracy. Ancient Egypt was a land of scribes and records. Grain counts, tax ledgers, temple donations, livestock tallies. Everything had to be written down. And as pharaoh, you were the final stop for nearly all of it. Not personally, of course. You didn't count bags of barley, but you had to approve things, read reports, issue decrees. Sometimes your orders were read aloud to entire provinces, carved into stone, and enforced by a hierarchy of officials you barely knew. You couldn't afford to be unclear. Even the act of writing wasn't casual. Hieroglyphs were sacred symbols. To write in them required training, patience, and reverence. Your official words, carved onto obelisks or painted in tombs, weren't just text. They were spells, and once inscribed, they couldn't be unsaid. Your advisors would present scrolls, sometimes with disputes between villagers about irrigation channels or property boundaries. You might be asked to decide which priest got to supervise a particular temple festival. You were expected to be wise in law, kind in judgment, and swift in decision. But how well could you possibly understand the daily life of a farmer in Lower Egypt from your seat in the palace? Still, you had to rule as though you did. What about recreation? Surely a pharaoh had some form of enjoyment. Well, yes, in a sense, but even that came with limits. Hunting in the desert was a common pastime, and it served a double purpose. Not only was it sport, it was symbolic. The pharaoh conquering the wild was seen as an echo of divine order defeating chaos. Killing a lion, for example, was not just bravery, it was religiously significant. But let's be honest, how fun is a hunt when everyone around you pretends it was heroic, even if your arrow missed and a servant finished the job? There were banquets, 2 grand ones with music, dancing, food, and wine. But the pharaoh had to remain composed, ceremonial, no drunken laughter, no slouching. You couldn't be seen chewing like an ordinary person. Even celebration was a performance. The musicians would sing your praises, the dancers move in choreographed reverence, and the guests would toast to your glory. You smiled and nodded, all the while knowing that if any of them displeased, you were worse. If you displeased them, there might be consequences. You could take a boat along the Nile. That part, at least, was truly beautiful. The river was calm in the evening, the papyrus swayed gently along the shores, and the stars overhead shimmered with stories of the gods. But you were never sailing alone. There were oarsmen, guards, and often another ritual, perhaps a visit to a temple or a stop to bless a field. Even leisure was structured. The palace itself was a marvel, but it could also feel like a cage. Its vast courtyards and long hallways echoed not just with footsteps, but with expectations. There were always decisions to make on construction projects, on diplomacy, on which relative to marry off to secure an alliance. You didn't have a single spouse. Most pharaohs had many, forming connections with noble families across the kingdom and even with foreign powers. These marriages weren't about love, they were strategy. A daughter might be sent to a Hittite prince. A sister might be married to a powerful general. Everyone in your bloodline was currency. And what of the daily people, the workers, the artisans, the farmers who actually kept Egypt running? You almost never saw them. They lived apart in dusty towns, hauling water, baking bread, harvesting flax, carving limestone. But you were in their thoughts constantly. They saw you as divine, as a source of protection and abundance. They built your tombs. They paid your taxes. They prayed for your health even as they bent over in the fields. If you failed them, there was no one else to blame. If you taxed them too harshly, they starved. If you let the temples hoard grain, riots could break out. All from your throne or your silence. And then, always in the background, there was death. Not just your death, the death of everyone you knew. Disease was common. Even in the palace, infection could spread through water or food. You might lose a wife, a son, a trusted servant, but you weren't allowed to grieve the way others did. Mourning had its own protocol. You were supposed to. embody strength and eternity. Even while your own mortality grew closer every day, your tomb workers, your artisans, your priests, they all knew what was coming. They saw your face in statues and on scrolls, but they also measured your bones and prepared your sarcophagus. They built false doors to confuse robbers, painted magical animals on the walls, and left you with tiny figurines called Ushabti servants for the afterlife, who would do labor so you wouldn't have to. Even your repose was a managed project. Still, some pharaohs tried to outwit death. They commissioned secret burial chambers, created booby-trapped corridors, or buried decoys to confuse would-be thieves. They left behind curses inscribed in ominous hieroglyphs. But in the end, none of it worked. Almost every tomb was eventually looted. The jewels were taken. The gold melted. The gods' names worn away. What did you really have to show for it all? A name on a crumbling wall, maybe. A statue missing its nose in a museum thousands of years later. Even the legacy was uncertain. A single bad harvest could wipe out decades of goodwill. A new pharaoh could chip your name off every monument. Your successor might declare you illegitimate. You could become a footnote in a scroll, or worse, a warning story told to future rulers. And yet, for all that, you carried on. You sat in judgment, you signed decrees, you led festivals, and you watched the sun rise over the Nile, knowing that somewhere in the distance, a temple bell was ringing in your name. But what happens when the pharaoh dies? When the rituals finally catch up, the priests gather, and the body is prepared? What does that final journey into the afterlife really look like? And who ensures that the living God becomes an eternal one? When a pharaoh died, Egypt didn't simply mourn it mobilized. The death of a living god was a state emergency, a ritual obligation, and a logistical nightmare. Everything had to happen precisely, in order, with the appropriate number of hymns, incense, waftings, and ceremonial cloths. After a life spent managing divine order, your death became the centerpiece of it. The moment your breath stopped, your identity split in two. Your body remained in this world, but your life force was thought to linger nearby, confused and in need of direction. The priests had to act fast. If the proper rites weren't performed, your might wander, hungry, angry, and forgotten. And a forgotten pharaoh was a dangerous spirit. Your body, still warm, would be taken away from its royal bedchamber and handed over to the They were specialists, and despite their sacred role, they operated outside the boundaries of normal society. You might have spent your life shrouded in gold and perfumed oils, but now strangers would cut you open, scoop out your brain through your nose, and place your liver in a ceramic jar shaped like a baboon. Mummification was a long, meticulous process, 40 days to dry the body with natron, another 15 for wrapping and ornamentation. During this time, your tomb had to be completed, your grave goods arranged, and your funeral scheduled. You were dead, but you were busier than ever. Your tomb was no longer just a construction site. It was the new seat of power. In theory, you were crossing into the field of Riza, perfect version of Egypt where the rivers always flooded. The fields never failed, and the wheat stood forever tall. But to get there, you had to survive the trials of the underworld. There were gates to pass through, each guarded by monsters with crocodile heads and serpents for arms. You'd need spells to appease them, passwords to confuse them, and magic. Items to protect your soul. All of this had to be arranged in advance by your priests and artists. These were not myths, not to the Egyptians. They were instructions. Your coffin was lined with them. Your tomb walls were inked with scenes of your journey sailing past demons, weighing your heart against a feather, pleading your case before Osiris himself. You were Pharaoh, yes, but in death, you were just another petitioner hoping to pass judgment. There were economic concerns too. Mummification was expensive, tombs even more so. If your successors were thrifty or resentful, they might cut corners. Your pyramid might be smaller, your grave goods fewer. Your name might be left off important prayers. And if no one said your name, well, in ancient Egypt, that was the second death. First came the loss of breath. Then came the loss of memory. Being forgotten was a fate worse than death, because it erased your place in both this world and the next. Some pharaohs tried to avoid this. They built grand monuments, left behind inscriptions of their greatness, named cities after themselves. But Egypt has a long memory and a short tolerance for failure. If your reign ended badly, your monuments might be dismantled. Priests could scrape your name off walls, bury your statues, erase you from official lists. Later dynasties might even rewrite history to suit their narrative. You could go from divine ruler to traitor overnight, depending on who held the pen. But let's say you were remembered. Let's say your tomb was intact, your name preserved, your offerings renewed every year by diligent priests. That still didn't mean peace, because even in death, you were not left alone. Tomb robbers were an ever-present threat. The Valley of the Kings, that lonely stretch of desert hills, was filled with treasuring temptation. Gold leaf, fine linen, ceremonial daggers, amulets carved from lapis and obsidian, not to mention grain, honey, oils, and beer gifts meant for the afterlife, but all too valuable in the here and now. Guards were posted, traps were built, curses were whispered. Still, many tombs were looted within decades. Robbers might rip through the linen wrappings, toss your body aside, steal the gilded mask from your face. The eternal home you spent your life planning might become a pit of broken pottery and missing bones. Some pharaohs tried to hide. Deep tombs, fake burial chambers, sealed passageways. They hoped secrecy would protect them. Others built larger temples in life so they could be worshipped openly after death, hoping a cult of followers would preserve their name. But Egypt's political climate was always shifting. Dynasties fell. Capitals moved. Languages changed. Priests were dismissed. And eventually, even the best-laid burial plans faded into sand. Still, you might ask, was it all for nothing? The answer depends on how you view power. For the pharaohs, life was not about happiness. It was about duty, continuity, and cosmic balance. You didn't rule for pleasure. You ruled to uphold Mat. Even if you were exhausted, isolated, or misunderstood, your purpose was bigger than comfort. You were a node between the mortal and the divine, and somehow, even thousands of years later, that belief carried through. Tourists still walk through. Karnak scholars still read your cartouches. Your sarcophagus, if found, might be displayed behind glass, admired by people from lands you never knew existed. Your face, idealized in stone, still stares down at the living. You were Pharaoh. That word still means something. But imagine, in your final moments, what passed through your mind. Did you think about your first morning as king? The feeling of sitting on the throne for the first time, legs dangling, too small for the seat. Did you remember your mother's voice, whispering prayers before a festival? The long corridors of your palace, the faces of the servants who never spoke unless summoned. Or did you simply wonder, was it worth it? Perhaps the most haunting truth of all is this. The pharaohs spent their entire lives preparing for death, and yet none of them ever knew what waited beyond the tomb. They followed the rituals, they uttered the spells, they built their eternity, brick by brick. But when the final stone was laid and the tomb sealed, no one could tell whether the gods truly welcomed them or simply watched in silence. The sand shifts endlessly over their graves. The Nile rises and falls. And above it all, the legacy of divine kingship lingers not in the gold or the granite, but in the quiet burden of power carried without rest. The life of Harald Hardrada, 1015 to 1066. The last great Viking king. You are not born a legend. Not even in the cold iron world of the Vikings. You begin as a second son, half forgotten among the flickering firelight of long houses, too small to wield a sword and too young to be taken seriously. Your name is Harald Sigurdsson, and in time, the world will call you Hardrada, the hard ruler. But in 1015, you're just another boy growing up in the shadows of stronger men. The first shadow is your brother. His name is Olaf Haraldsson, a warlord who becomes a king who becomes a saint. You will spend your life chasing and escaping his memory. But for now, Olaf is the one who rides out to battle while you stay behind and sharpen blades. Listen to the creak of shields, and imagine your time will come. It does. Too soon, in the year 1030. You are 15 years old and marching with Olaf to reclaim the throne of Norway from the Danes. The wind is sharp on your cheeks, the ground muddy beneath your boots, and every breath smells of horses, iron, and the damp leather of men preparing for death. The battle is at Stiklestad. Your brother is killed. You are wounded and barely escape. The rebellion has failed. You flee east, away from the mountains of Norway, across rivers, forests, and strange borders. You become a refugee, not in the sense of paperwork or politics, but in the deepest, most personal way, a man without land, without power, without a home. You are 15 years old, covered in blood, and entirely alone. But you are not done. You make your way to Kiev on Rus, to the court of Prince Yaroslav, the Wise. He takes you in. You speak Norse. He speaks Old East Slavic. But power has a language of its own. You train under his men. You ride with his cavalry. You learn how to survive a winter without firewood, and how to break a man's line with a spear. You are taller now, broader, growing into something that others begin to notice. But still, you are not king. By your 20s, you have made a decision most men would not consider. You head south, far from the fjords and birch trees, to the glittering, confusing, corrupt heart of another world, Byzantium. You join the Varangian Guard, an elite corps of warriors who serve the Emperor of Constantinople. They are all outsiders like you. Swedes, Danes, Rus, and now one young, bitter Norwegian. In Byzantium, the rules are different. You march not for clan or kin, but for gold. You learn to wear silk beneath your armor. You fight in Asia Minor, in Sicily, in Jerusalem. You burn cities and receive coins with the emperor's face stamped on them. You live in marble palaces and sleep under domed ceilings painted with saints whose names you cannot pronounce. You serve emperors who come and go, some deposed, some assassinated. You learn that loyalty is negotiable and that mercy is rare. By now, you have a name, Harald. Not just a name, but a reputation. You are not just a soldier, you are a commander. Some say you led 40 battles before you turned 30. Others say You carved your name into the marble walls of Constantinople, graffiti in runes to mark your presence. You are not a saint like your brother. You are something else, sharper, colder, harder, but home still calls. You leave Byzantium. Around the year 1045, you are rich with plunder and pay. You return to Kiev and Rus, then cross back to the lands of Norway, now ruled by Magnus, the good your nephew. There is tension, of course. Two claimants, one throne. But compromise is made, money changes hands, and eventually, when Magnus dies in 1047, you take the crown. At last. You are king. And now, the hard part begins. Norway in the mid-11th century is not a place of easy rule. The people are not united. The land is long and fractured. There are powerful families who remember your brother, and others who remember your enemies. Every fjord has its own politics. Every chieftain has his own ambition. You, the once exile, must now hold it all together. You rule harshly. That is what the sagas will say. But harshness, in this time, is not a flaw. It is a requirement. You tax heavily, perhaps too heavily. You crush rebellions. You kill those who stand in your way. You are not trying to be beloved. You are trying to be remembered. And still, it is not enough, because while Norway bends under your rule, Denmark does not. You believe you have a right to it, as did your brother. But Denmark resists. You campaign, you raid, but you do not conquer. The crown of Denmark remains a distant prize, and eventually you let it go instead. Your gaze shifts west. In 1066, news reaches you of a succession crisis in England. Edward the Confessor has died. Harold Godwinson has taken the throne, but another man, William of Normandy, also claims it. And then, through a series of alliances and half-promises, you are drawn in. You believe you, too, have a claim that is your final gamble. You are over 50 now. Most men your age are dead or dreaming by the hearth, but not you. You gather ships, men, axes, banners. You cross the North Sea once more, just as you had crossed the rivers of Rus and the deserts of Byzantium. You arrive in the north of England with thousands of warriors. You win a battle at Fulford. You are strong, confident. You have done this before, but England is not like Byzantium or Norway. The English king, Harold Godwinson, marches his army north in a matter of days. They meet you at Stamford Bridge, and there, beneath the September sky, it ends. You fight bravely, of course you do. The sagas say you wore no armor that day, that you fought tall and wild, like a berserker, that you died with a sword in your hand and your name on the wind. But the battle is lost. Your army is broken. Your body lies among the fallen. And just weeks later, Harold Godwinson will die too, defeated by William the Conqueror at Hastings. 3 kings, gone in a single season. But it is your death, Harold, that marks the end of something far older. The Viking Age ends with you, not in fire and glory, but in a field far from home, where the river flows quietly and the crows circle overhead. But how did the sagas remember you? As tyrant or hero? And what of the treasures you brought from Byzantium? The knowledge of distant lands, the scars of so many wars, were they buried with you, or scattered to the winds? The wind in Norway never forgets a name, and Harold had name, like the roar of a distant waterfall or the groan of a winter glacier, lingered long after his death. But how was he remembered, not as the man who died at Stamford Bridge, but as the man who ruled? To understand Harold, you must follow the details. The daily drudgery of kingship, the grind behind the glory. You might picture Harold on horseback, cloak flying behind him, barking orders over the din of battle. But much of his reign was spent, not in combat, but in counsel. You ruled Norway not with sword alone, but with compromise, correspondence, and constant calculation. The land was jagged long coastlines, scattered islands, deep valleys carved by ice and time. Messages could take weeks. Local chieftains held sway over their regions, and loyalty often came at a price. You had to send emissaries, not flashy warriors, but scribes and traders, men who could negotiate, gather intelligence, feel the temperature of discontent. A rebellion could brew in a fishing village or a fjord too small for a map, and you had to know before it burned. Harold's court was no shining hall of gold and laughter. It was a place of strategy. You held gatherings, called things, where free men could voice grievances, settle disputes, and hear royal decrees. But these were not democratic forums. You managed them carefully. You bribed, threatened, and persuaded as needed. You allowed talk, yes, but only enough to keep the peace. True power stayed close to your chest. You also faced the church. Christianity had made its way into Norway by the time you returned from the east. Your brother Olaf had fought hard to Christianize the kingdom, sometimes literally, burning pagan temples and executing those who resisted. You, Harold, inherited the aftermath. You were no zealot, but neither could you afford to alienate the growing Christian establishment. So you built churches. You patronized bishops. You gave land to monasteries, but you also kept the old gods in your back pocket. The people, still, whispered of Odin and Thor in the forests. You didn't stop them. You knew better than to cut ties to every old belief. Religion was useful, both new and old. There were other practical matters: roads, grain stores, winter supplies, coinage. Harold issued coinza, practice learned in part from his time in Byzantium. There were small silver pieces, stamped with your image, meant to standardize trade and demonstrate centralized authority. You were building a country, not just raiding one. Standard weights and measures, legal systems, royal inspectors, these were the invisible tools of your rule, and they weren't glorious. No one wrote sagas about tax reform, but without them, your kingdom would have rotted from within. Your home base was Trondheim, known then as Nidaros. From there, you oversaw a web of harbors and trading towns. You didn't just count warriors, you counted barrels of dried fish, bolts of wool, the contents of incoming ships. Trade flowed in from England, Denmark, even further south. You needed that wealth. Wars were expensive, and so was loyalty. You also had a wife too, in fact, depending on which accounts you read. Elisiv of Kiev, a noblewoman from Rus, gave your rule a sense of legitimacy on the world stage. She was well-born, cultured, politically valuable. But there was also Tora Torbergsdatter, from one of the most powerful Norwegian families. She gave you sons. Both wives lived, possibly at the same time, possibly at odds. Court life in your Norway was not neat. It was a delicate balance of inheritance, prestige, and power, always on the verge of slipping. And what of your sons? You had two who would rise to rule: Magnus and Olaf, both named after your ancestors. You raised them in your image, but you also tried to secure their succession. That meant more diplomacy, more negotiation with powerful families. You knew what it meant to grow up in exile, and you didn't want that fate for your children. But bloodlines weren't enough. The kingdom still eyed you with caution. You were tall, fierce, and famously severe. You rarely smiled, the story said, and when you did, it meant something dangerous. You did not forget insults. You did not forgive easily. Your justice was absolute, sometimes cruel, and often effective. You had a code, perhaps not written, but lived. Loyalty rewarded, betrayal punished. In a land where life was often short and winters were long, clarity was more valuable than charm. Still, not everyone feared you. Some followed you with genuine admiration. The soldiers who had campaigned with you across the rivers of the East, the Varangians who remembered your youth, the poets who sang of your battles. These men saw you not as a tyrant, but as a leader shaped by the storm. Hard, yes, but fair in their eyes. You commissioned scald-scored poets to sing your praises, record your victories, and shape your legend. This was not just vanity, it was insurance. In a world with little written history, memory was preserved in verse. And you ensured your memory was bold, sharpened, and public. Your legacy spread, not only through war, but through architecture, law, and language. You connected the scattered chieftaincies of Norway under a firmer crown than any before you. Brought home the lessons of empire from the glittering mosaics of Byzantium to the carved shields of Rus. And you left Norway stronger than you found it. But always you carried restlessness. There was always something unfinished, something still out of reach. You had ruled, but not united all Scandinavia. You had conquered, but not endured. You had tasted empire, but never worn its crown. And that is why, in the final years of your life, you looked west to England. You had heard the rumors. King Edward was childless. The throne would be contested. Your name was mentioned, perhaps sincerely, perhaps politically. You believed you had a claim, through ties to Canute, and promises whispered in candlelit halls. But it was more than that. For a man like you, shaped by war, by exile, by ambition, you needed one last campaign, one final stage. You could not simply grow old by the hearth, watching your sons squabble and the seasons pass. You had left too much of yourself on foreign battlefields to fade quietly into domestic peace. So, you prepared. In 1066, you gathered your forces. Ships lined the Norwegian coast long, lean, and hungry. Sails were patched, blades sharpened, provisions salted and stowed. You had allies in the north of England. You planned your movements carefully. Land in Yorkshire, strike, before the Saxons could organize. The moment seemed right, a kingdom in flux, a chance at a new crown. You set sail across the cold waters. You must have thought of Constantinople, of the warm stone of Jerusalem, of the burning cities of Sicily, of your brother dying at Stiklestad. You had come far from the boy in his shadow. You were now your own myth. You landed in England. You won your first engagement, Fulford a hard-fought victory, and then, in only days, it changed. King Harold Godwinson marched north with terrifying speed. He caught you at Stamford Bridge, unprepared. The battle began with surprise, but ended with certainty. Your forces were overrun. The day was lost. And there, in the chaos and the blood, you died. But the story doesn't end with your last breath. It ends with what came after, your men fleeing, your sons surviving, your legend spreading. Your death marked the end of the Viking Age, they say. After Stamford Bridge and Hastings, the world shifted. Kings no longer raided, they taxed. Battles no longer relied on berserkers. They required supply chains and feudal levies. Empire would no longer be seized with axes, but negotiated in parchment. You were the last to live as both the raider and the ruler, the exile and the emperor in waiting, the Viking and the king. But what of your legacy? What did your children inherit, and what, if anything, did they reject? What remained of your rule once your bones were returned to Norway and the winds of England forgot your name? After Stamford Bridge, the longboats returned to Norway, not in triumph but in mourning. The sea carried back fewer men, fewer voices. The sails hung lower. The oars moved slower, and beneath the planks, wrapped in cloth and salt and silence, lay the body of King Harald Hardrada. But in truth, Harald's death was not the end. It was a transition. The last breath of the Viking Age did not vanish into the wind. It sank slowly into the earth, carried by the men who still remembered how it felt to follow a hard ruler into the storm back in Norway. The news came slowly, carried by sailors, merchants, rumors. King Harald was dead, killed in England. The reactions were mixed. Some mourned. They remembered a man who held the kingdom together in a time of chaos. A king who enforced law when law was fragile. A ruler who punished rebellion, yes, but who also made the roads safer, the coinage consistent, the markets more predictable. Norway under Harald was not always easy, but it was organized. In a world of shifting loyalties and fragmented territories, that mattered more than affection. Others felt relief. He had ruled long, nearly 20 years, not always gently. His taxes were heavy, his justice swift. He had centralized power in ways that had weakened the autonomy of the local chieftains. For those who had opposed him and survived, his death opened a door. New alliances could be made, new claims pressed. The game, as always, began anew. But for his sons, Magnus and Olaf, there was no time for ceremony. Succession in medieval Scandinavia was never simple. It wasn't guaranteed by birth alone. It had to be confirmed in blood, in oaths, and often in steel. Magnus, the elder, had ruled jointly with Harald before the fateful expedition to England. Now he ruled alone for a brief moment, but he died just 3 years later in 1069, and Olaf, called Olaf Kaya, the Peaceful, took the throne. Olaf's reign was in many ways a deliberate contrast to his father's. He did not march on foreign lands, he did not raid. He did not seek new kingdoms across the sea. Instead, he ruled from Bergen. He built churches, he issued laws, he fostered trade. It was almost as if the kingdom itself was exhaling. But even Olaf's peace was not a rejection of Harald's legacy. It was a continuation of Itan evolution. The centralized systems Harald had worked to build allowed Olaf to govern without war. The stability Harald had enforced with sword and decree became the foundation upon which his son could promote literacy, commerce, and Christianity. Still, Harald's image lingered. The sagas remembered him as tall, powerful, commanding. His nickname, Hardrada, meant hard ruler, but not necessarily cruel. It meant firm, unbending. He had been forged in exile, tempered in foreign lands, and returned like iron to a land that needed steel. Even his enemies, in time, spoke of him with a kind of grim admiration. In England, where he died, he became a figure of strange, distant, part of a tragic prelude. His invasion had softened King Harold Godwinson just enough that when William of Normandy landed weeks later, the Saxons were weakened, weary, stretched thin. Some historians still argue, if Harold had not attacked when he did, would William have won at Hastings? You also faced the church. Christianity had made its way into Norway by the time you returned from the east. Your brother Olaf had fought hard to Christianize the kingdom, sometimes literally, burning pagan temples and executing those who resisted. You, Harold, inherited the aftermath. You were no zealot, but neither could you afford to alienate the growing Christian establishment. So you built churches, you patronized bishops, you gave land to monasteries, but you also kept the old gods in your back pocket. The people still whispered of Odin and Thor in the forests. You didn't stop them. You knew better than to cut ties to every old belief. Religion was useful, both new and old. There were other practical matters: roads, grain stores, winter supplies, coinage. Harold issued coinza, practice learned in part from his time in Byzantium. There were small silver pieces, stamped with your image, meant to standardize trade and demonstrate centralized authority. You were building a country, not just raiding one. Standard weights and measures, legal systems, royal inspectors, these were the invisible tools of your rule, and they weren't glorious. No one wrote sagas about tax reform, but without them, your kingdom would have rotted from within. Your home base was Trondheim, known then as Nidaros. From there, you oversaw a web of harbors and trading towns. You didn't just count warriors, you counted barrels of dried fish, bolts of wool, the contents of incoming ships. Trade flowed in from England, Denmark, even further south. You needed that wealth. Wars were expensive, and so was loyalty. You also had a wife too. In fact, depending on which accounts you read, Elisiv of Kiev, a noblewoman from Rus, gave your rule a sense of legitimacy on the world stage. She was well-born, cultured, politically valuable. But there was also Tora Torbergsdatter, from one of the most powerful Norwegian families. She gave you sons. Both wives lived, possibly at the same time, possibly at odds. Court life in your Norway was not neat. It was a delicate balance of inheritance, prestige, and power, always on the verge of slipping. And what of your sons? You had two who would rise to rule: Magnus and Olaf, both named after your ancestors. You raised them in your image, but you also tried to secure their succession. That meant more diplomacy, more negotiation with powerful families. You knew what it meant to grow up in exile, and you didn't want that fate for your children. But bloodlines weren't enough. The kingdom still eyed you with caution. You were tall, fierce, and famously severe. You rarely smiled, the story said, and when you did, it meant something dangerous. You did not forget insults. You did not forgive easily. Your justice was absolute, sometimes cruel, and often effective. You had a code, perhaps not written, but lived. Loyalty rewarded, betrayal punished. In a land where life was often short and winters were long, clarity was more valuable than charm. Still, not everyone feared you. Some followed you with genuine admiration. The soldiers who had campaigned with you across the rivers of the East, the Varangians who remembered your youth, the poets who sang of your battles. These men saw you not as a tyrant, but as a leader shaped by the storm. Hard, yes, but fair in their eyes. You commissioned Skoldskort poets to sing your praises, record your victories, and shape your legend. This was not just vanity, it was insurance. In a world with little written history, memory was preserved in verse, and you ensured your memory was bold, sharpened, and public. Your legacy spread, not only through war, but through architecture, law, and language. You connected the scattered chieftaincies of Norway under a firmer crown than any before you. brought home the lessons of empire, from the glittering mosaics of Byzantium to the carved shields of Rus. And you left Norway stronger than you found it. But always you carried restlessness. There was always something unfinished, something still out of reach. You had ruled, but not united all Scandinavia. You had conquered, but not endured. You had tasted empire, but never worn its crown. And that is why, in the final years of your life, you looked west to England. You had heard the rumors. King Edward was childless. The throne would be contested. Your name was mentioned, perhaps sincerely, perhaps politically. You believed you had a claim, through ties to Canute, and promises whispered in candlelit halls. But it was more than that. For a man like you, shaped by war, by exile, by ambition, you needed one last campaign, one final stage. You could not simply grow old by the hearth, watching your sons squabble and the seasons pass. You had left too much of yourself on foreign battlefields to fade quietly into domestic peace. So, you prepared. In 1066, you gathered your forces. Ships lined the Norwegian coast, long, lean, and hungry. Sails were patched, blades sharpened, provisions salted and stowed. You had allies in the north of England. You planned your movements carefully. Land in Yorkshire, strike before the Saxons could organize. The moment seemed right, a kingdom in flux, a chance at a new crown. You set sail across the cold waters. You must have thought of Constantinople, of the warm stone of Jerusalem, of the burning cities of Sicily, of your brother dying at Stiklestad. You had come far from the boy in his shadow. You were now your own myth. You landed in England. You won your first engagement, Fulford a hard-fought victory, and then, in only days, it changed. King Harold Godwinson marched north with terrifying speed. He caught you at Stamford Bridge, unprepared. The battle began with surprise, but ended with certainty. Your forces were overrun. The day was lost. And there, in the chaos and the blood, you died. But the story doesn't end with your last breath. It ends with what came after, your men fleeing, your sons surviving, your legend spreading. Your death marked the end of the Viking Age, they say. After Stamford Bridge and Hastings, the world shifted. Kings no longer raided, they taxed. Battles no longer relied on berserkers. They required supply chains and feudal levies. Empire would no longer be seized with axes, but negotiated in parchment. You were the last to live as both the raider and the ruler, the exile and the emperor in waiting, the Viking and the king. But what of your legacy? What did your children inherit, and what, if anything, did they reject? What remained of your rule once your bones were returned to Norway and the winds of England forgot your name? After Stamford Bridge, the longboats returned to Norway, not in triumph but in mourning. The sea carried back fewer men, fewer voices. The sails hung lower. The oars moved slower. And beneath the planks, wrapped in cloth and salt and silence, lay the body of King Harold Hardrada. But in truth, Harold's death was not the end. It was a transition. The last breath of the Viking Age did not vanish into the wind. It sank slowly into the earth, carried by the men who still remembered how it felt to follow a hard ruler into the storm back in Norway. The news came slowly, carried by sailors, merchants, rumors. King Harold was dead, killed in England. The reactions were mixed. Some mourned. They remembered a man who held the kingdom together in a time of chaos. A king who enforced law when law was fragile. A ruler who punished rebellion Yes, but who also made the roads safer, the coinage consistent, the markets more predictable. Norway under Harald was not always easy, but it was organized. In a world of shifting loyalties and fragmented territories, that mattered more than affection. Others felt relief. He had ruled long, nearly 20 years, not always gently. His taxes were heavy, his justice swift. He had centralized power in ways that had weakened the autonomy of the local chieftains. For those who had opposed him and survived, his death opened a door. New alliances could be made, new claims pressed. The game, as always, began anew. But for his sons, Magnus and Olaf, there was no time for ceremony. Succession in medieval Scandinavia was never simple. It wasn't guaranteed by birth alone. It had to be confirmed in blood, in oaths, and often in steel. Magnus, the elder, had ruled jointly with Harald before the fateful expedition to England. Now he ruled alone for a brief moment, but he died just 3 years later in 1069, and Olaf, called Olaf Kaya the Peaceful, took the throne. Olaf's reign was in many ways a deliberate contrast to his father's. He did not march on foreign lands, he did not raid. He did not seek new kingdoms across the sea. Instead, he ruled from Bergen. He built churches, he issued laws, he fostered trade. It was almost as if the kingdom itself was exhaling. But even Olaf's peace was not a rejection of Harald's legacy. It was a continuation of Itan evolution. The centralized systems Harald had worked to build allowed Olaf to govern without war. The stability Harald had enforced with sword and decree became the foundation upon which his son could promote literacy, commerce, and Christianity. Still, Harald's image lingered. The sagas remembered him as tall, powerful, commanding. His nickname, Hardrada, meant hard ruler, but not necessarily cruel. It meant firm, unbending. He had been forged in exile, tempered in foreign lands, and returned like iron to a land that needed steel. Even his enemies, in time, spoke of him with a kind of grim admiration. In England, where he died, he became a figure of strange, distant, part of a tragic prelude. His invasion had softened King Harold Godwinson just enough that when William of Normandy landed weeks later, the Saxons were weakened, weary, stretched thin. Some historians still argue, if Harold had not attacked when he did, would William have won at Hastings? And then there's Sutton, who in England, arguably the most famous ship burial in the Anglo-Saxon world, but closely related in tradition. It suggests the custom wasn't isolated to Scandinavia. The idea of a ship as coffin, as statement, as sacred vessel, stretched across the North Sea like a shared whisper. But here's the quieter truth. Most people weren't buried this way. Most Vikings were cremated. Some buried in simple pits, others in shallow graves with modest goods. A comb, maybe, a knife, a few beads. The grand ship burials were exceptions. Rare, extravagant exceptions. That's why they matter, because they show what the living wanted, the dead to represent. They were stagecraft, burial as theatre. The mound, the ship, the goods, they were all part of a performance meant to outlast breath. But what did the Vikings believe about death? That depends on the source. Some believed in Valhalla, where warriors fought by day and feasted by night. Others spoke of Hela realm beneath the earth, not a place of fire, but of stillness. Others still believed in reincarnation, or in a journey across a cold river, ferried by unknown hands. What's clear is that they took the journey seriously. They gave the dead weapons to fight, food to eat, clothes to wear. They imagined a continuation of life, not just survival, but dignity. A king in life should be a king in death. The ship was the vehicle, but it was also the symbol of motion, of passage, of identity. Vikings were seafarers. To bury someone in a ship was to acknowledge that you were not anchored. You were in transit, even in death. And yet, over time, the burials stopped. Christianity came, slowly, then all at once. The bishops frowned upon ship burials. Pagan rites were outlawed. Graves became simpler. Crosses replaced stones. Churches claimed the dead. Memory changed, but the mounds remained, covered in grass, misshapen by erosion, but still there, holding their silence. And when archaeologists finally returned, 10 centuries later, they found not just bones and iron, but echoes of rituals carefully practiced, of stories half lost, of a people who honored death not with fear, but with structure and meaning and awe. So the next time you see a Viking ship in a museum, picture it not on the water, but in the soil, not cutting through the waves, but resting beneath stone, not gone, but waiting. Waiting for what? For memory, for your curiosity, for the question no saga ever fully answered: who decided what mattered enough to bury in a ship? Not all ship burials were for kings or queens. Some were for people whose names have long since vanished, whose identities are buried not only under soil and stones, but under layers of cultural memory. Still, their graves tell stories. The ships were not just markers of status, they were messages, carefully constructed, addressed to the future in the Viking world. The boundaries between the living and the dead were porous. The dead could influence the living, linger in places, even return if, not physically, then in legend, omen, or presence. Ship burials were a way to honor and contain that power by placing the dead in ships. The Vikings were not only sending them off, they were anchoring them. The ship became a controlled space, a house for the dead. It allowed the community to say, this person is gone, but also here, safely watched over. The mound, the ship, the grave goods all were part of a larger ritual meant to maintain cosmic balance. Imagine now the village that surrounded one of these burials. It would be days of preparation, wood chopped, cloth dyed, messages sent to neighboring settlements, cattle slaughtered, mead brewed, skalds summoned to compose verses for the occasion. People didn't mourn alone. They mourned together with sound, smoke, and spectacle. The burial itself might take place at the edge of the settlement, high on a hill near the water. The ship, a dark silhouette against the horizon, would have been seen for miles. Its presence was not meant to be hidden. It was meant to loom a permanent reminder of a life and a death. There were patterns, of course. Ships were often pointed in a certain direction, or the sea, or the sunrise, or even aligned with constellations. These weren't random choices. The Vikings were navigators. They understood the sky, the wind, the currents. Direction mattered. It gave meaning to movement, even when the ship no longer moved. Some ships were not real ships at all. They were symbolic stone outlines arranged in the shape of a vessel. The Ale stones in Sweden, for example, form a massive ship-shaped formation using standing stones. The site dates to the late Iron Age, but the idea persisted into the Viking era. Even when the sea was far, the metaphor of a ship endured. This tells you something important. The ship was not just a mode of transport, it was a symbol of identity. Vikings saw themselves not just as warriors or farmers, but as people in motion. To be Viking was to go to cross borders, to navigate waters, to encounter the unknown. A ship wasn't only for trade or war. It was a worldview, and so, in death, it made sense to return to that shape, to lie in the very vessel that once carried you across the edge of the world. But it's worth noting, these ships didn't sail into the afterlife. They stayed, buried, covered, preserved by accident, because of the soil, the dampness, the pressure of the mound. That's how we found them when the Gokstad ship was excavated in 1880. It had rested for nearly 1,000 years. The wood still mostly intact. The iron nails rusted, but recognizable. The ship had been looted, of course, centuries earlier, but the shape, the intent, the grandeur remained. Even now, under bright museum lights, it speaks. And yet, the man inside is largely forgotten. We know he was tall, perhaps over 6 feet, powerful, likely. He had been buried with weapons, but they were gone when the archaeologists arrived. So were most of the valuables. What remained were the traces: sleds, tents, beds, carved animal heads, things that told us someone wanted him to travel in style. But who? A son, a loyal circle of warriors, a community bound by shared grief and myth. We don't know. That's the strange thing about ship burials. They are among the most magnificent archaeological discoveries of the Viking Age, yet they are full of absences. Names missing, lives half told. We know more about their ships than their thoughts, more about their rituals than their reasons. And then, sometimes, there are surprises. Take the Psalm ships, found on the island of Saaremaa in modern-day Estonia. 2 ships, 20 meters long, buried side by side, discovered in 2008. They weren't grand ceremonial tombs, they were battlefield graves. Dozens of warriors, buried with weapons, gaming pieces, and food. No mound, no posthumous celebration. Just the hurried, reverent burial of comrades. Defined, challenged assumptions. Ship burials weren't always planned. Sometimes they were improvised, responses to loss in the middle of life. Still, even in haste, the symbolism remained. Ship equals passage. Even if no one had time to carve runes or raise a mound, the meaning stayed. Other burials bring even more mystery. Take the Scar Boat burial in Orkney, found in 1991. Inside 3 people, a man, a woman, and a child, buried with brooches, a sword, and a boned comb. The boat had long since rotted away, but its shape remained, ghost in the soil. Who were they? A family, a warrior and his kin. The items suggest wealth and status. The care suggests love, but the truth unknown. And perhaps that's the most human thing about these graves. For all their grandeur, they are deeply personal. Someone loved these people. Someone believed in their journey. Someone gave up treasure to send them off properly. These were not just statements of power, they were expressions of connection. But then the culture shifted. By the end of the Viking Age, the church had grown stronger. Christian burials spread. Graves became simpler, oriented east-west. The dead were no longer buried with weapons or goods. The soul was to face resurrection, not sail into another realm. The ship burials stopped. Not entirely. There were holdouts. There were hybrid burials, where Christian crosses mixed with traditional goods. But by the 11th and 12th centuries, the old rites faded. The mounds were left to the wind. The names were lost. And yet, the idea of ship burial never quite died. It stayed in the imagination. In Icelandic sagas, the dead often spoke. They rose from graves. They warned their descendants. They offered advice or curses. Ships sailed through dreams and omens. Burial sites became places of power, not just memory. Even today, you can feel it stand near a Viking mound, and there is a kind of quiet, a presence, not threatening, not haunted, just waiting. It is not the ghost of a person, but the echo of belief. A belief that death was not the end, that life's journey deserved a vessel, that even in soil, motion remained possible. And maybe that's why we remember ship burials, not just for the splendor or the mystery, but because they remind us that the dead were once in motion, that they had places to go, and people to see, and dreams to follow, just like us. But what did those buried think would happen next? Did they expect to wake in another world? Or did they simply hope their names would be remembered? And if not their names, then at least the shape of the ship that carried them. You stand now at the foot of a burial mound. Grass grows in patches. A few stones poke through the soil. The wood of the ship is long gone rotted, eaten by time. But beneath your feet, the outline still rests. And in some way, the story still moves. This was once a ship, pulled across the land not to carry goods, but to carry someone out of the world. Who was that person? You will never know, but that's part of the lesson. In Viking ship burials, the details that survive aren't names or dates, they're symbols. Shapes, motions, a sword, a brooch, a drinking horn. They're fragments of a life, chosen by those left behind. And this, more than anything, tells you something deeply human. The living care deeply about how the dead are remembered. But what happened after the burial? In some places, the mound became a marker, a permanent feature of the landscape. Local people might avoid it or revere it. Children might play near it, make up stories. Generations passed, and the grave became part of the scenery. Something old, something strange, a memory no one quite remembered. In other places, Christianization brought a change. Priests viewed the ship graves with suspicion. They were pagan, they were extravagant. They competed with the growing theology of resurrection and humility. And so, some mounds were destroyed, flattened, dug up and forgotten. Others were left to fade under new meanings, sacred trees, folk stories, place names by the medieval period. Most people had forgotten what lay beneath, but the ground remembered. When archaeologists began exploring these sites in the 19th and 20th centuries, they weren't always sure what they'd find. A few stories from local farmers, a strange bump in the field, a tale of old bones, and then digging, always digging. In 1904, the Oseberg ship was uncovered, buried under a mound, on a Norwegian farm. Its discovery changed everything. The ship was astonishing, 21 meters long, carved with dragon heads, lined with rivets, built for both beauty and power. But the real surprise came with its contents, and opulent burial chamber filled with over 40 rich grave goods, sleds, carved posts, textiles, and animal bones. And at the center, 2 women. The women's identities are still debated. One was older, around 70. The other, younger, perhaps a servant, or perhaps a priestess, or something else entirely. No weapons, no gold, but luxury, unmistakably. Their burial challenged assumptions. Power in Viking society, it seemed, wasn't only held by men. These women had status, wealth, and influence. They were buried with ceremony, with meaning, but perhaps the most powerful thing they had was space. A ship. A carved, massive, once seaworthy ship. A stage for memory. A message in oak and iron and stone. Then there was the Gokstad ship, discovered in 1880, also in Norway. A warrior's grave. The ship itself had a broader, more practical design. It had seen battle, maybe even long voyages. It had been repaired, used, trusted. The man buried there was in his 40s, over 6 feet tall, likely injured in life. His burial chamber was sparse. Grave robbers had cleared most items centuries earlier, but what remained suggested royalty or high military status. It wasn't just the individual that mattered, it was the effort. These ships were not easy to build, not easy to move, not easy to bury. Their very existence as graves suggests a culture that placed deep meaning in labor. Death wasn't a quiet slipping away, it was a performance, rehearsed across generations. And what about the people who built the grave? We rarely think of them, but they were there. The shipwrights, the rope pullers, the women who prepared the body, the men who dug the trench, the children watching from the edge of the crowd, wide-eyed and quiet. The skald who composed a verse, perhaps never written down. The old woman who remembered a similar burial in her youth, her hands clasped tight around her walking stick. A burial was never just for the dead. It was a moment when the living confronted time, and Viking time moved differently. You weren't immortal through writing. You were immortal through memory spoken aloud, sung over fires, whispered across fjords. Your deeds lived on if others chose to speak of them. And so, burial was not about preservation. It was about inscription into collective memory, and ships were the perfect metaphor. They moved, they carried, they survived storms. Even now, when we picture a Viking, we picture the ship, the long oars, the curved prow, the crew leaning into the cold wind. We picture movement, and when we picture death, we picture the same. The funeral ship in flames, or the mound, ship-shaped, waiting. It tells you something about the Viking imagination. The journey doesn't end, it continues, always. Somewhere, the mythology reflects this. The dead sail, or they cross bridges, or they are ferried. Rarely do they simply vanish. They are moving still. This belief didn't vanish with Christianization. It adapted. You see it in the way Scandinavian folklore preserves sea spirits, wandering souls, and revenants. You see it in the shape of cathedrals built along old, sacred sites. You see it even in the way modern Norwegians speak of heritage as identity, see as history. And then, centuries later, museums, the Gokstad ship, the Oseberg ship, the Tune ship, reconstructed, preserved, placed in glass buildings and visited by tourists. They do not move anymore, but they still carry something, the memory of those long gone, and not just the dead, but the culture that buried them. People come, peer in, whisper. They walk slowly. They take pictures, but mostly they wonder, what kind of people gave this to the dead? Not just warriors or raiders, but artisans, builders, storytellers, people who knew that life ended, but legacy could be crafted if the vessel was strong enough. And now you stand again at the mound. The wind hums low through the grass. A crow cuts across the sky. Somewhere, below your feet, iron rusts quietly in the dark. There are no more skalds, no more grave women, No more sleds filled with textiles and animal bones. But the shape remains, and in that shape is an idea that death is not a stop, but a departure. That to be buried in a ship was not to sink, but to sail into the unknown, carried not by wind or oars, but by memory. And now the question remains, when you are gone, what will carry you forward? What shape will your memory take? Because, in the end, the ship was never just for the dead. It was a mirror for the living. Courtly. Love and chivalric romancier, sitting on a cold stone bench in a shadowy corner of a medieval castle courtyard. The wind smells of hay and soot, and somewhere in the distance, a lute is playing a thin, wavering tune. A lady walks past in a gown that drags along the flagstones. A knight watches her with all the intensity of a man about to write a poem. But he doesn't speak. He bows, formally, then turns away. Welcome to the confusing, rule-bound, deeply impractical world of courtly love. You may think of medieval romance as filled with knights rescuing damsels, slaying dragons, and riding off into the sunset. But the actual practice of courtly love was far less dramatic and far more exhausting. It was less about love and more about structure. Less about passion and more about performance. Let's begin at the beginning. Courtly love emerged around the 12th century in the courts of southern France, particularly in the region of Aquitaine. It was part poetry, part flirtation, part social. Ritual. The idea was this: a knight or nobleman would devote himself to a lady, often one far above his station or already married. He would write poetry for her. He would perform deeds in her honor. He would suffer, publicly and beautifully, from the pain of loving her from afar. It was all terribly dramatic and almost entirely symbolic. This wasn't about marriage. In fact, marriage was often considered a hindrance to true love. A noblewoman's marriage was usually a political transaction. Her husband might be much older. The match might have been arranged since childhood. Real romantic affection was inconvenient, but courtly love, that was something else. It was a game of admiration structured by rules, filled with longing, and deeply theatrical. Think of it like a performance, with very high stakes and very little payoff. Here's how it worked. First, the knight would choose a lady to serve. She would be noble, unattainable, virtuous. The less accessible she was, the better. He would address her in poems, using grand titles: my heart's empress, my guiding star, the flame of my soul. He would then begin the long, slow process of adoring her without touching her, without compromising her honor, and often without any expectation of real intimacy. He might ride in a tournament wearing her colors, perhaps a ribbon tied to his arm. He might compose songs in her praise. He might sigh in doorways. The woman's role was equally stylized. She would be gracious, reserved, often distant. She might accept his gestures, sometimes coldly, sometimes with modest approval, but rarely with enthusiasm. Her restraint was part of the drama. There were manuals for this. Andreas Capellanus, a 12th century French cleric, wrote The Art of Courtly Love, which outlined rules like, marriage is no excuse for not loving, or he who is not jealous cannot love. It included fake dialogues between knights and noblewomen, awkward, formal conversations where love was declared with all the subtlety of a tax report. Yet people read these guides. They followed the forms. They learned the vocabulary. Love, in the courtly sense, wasn't about feeling. It was about language. But why go to all this trouble? Partly because medieval life was deeply hierarchical. Everything had rules: land, inheritance, piety, love, too, needed a structure. Courtly love allowed noblemen and noblewomen to participate in emotional expression without violating the rigid codes of marriage and property. It also gave women, at least noble women, a certain cultural power. In this system, the lady had the upper hand. The man was the servant. The woman's approval was the reward. It inverted, briefly and symbolically, the usual gender dynamics of the time. But this power was largely symbolic. A woman might have a knight's admiration, but that didn't grant her legal autonomy or protect her from being married off to someone politically advantageous. Courtly love was a kind of escaper-sanctioned fantasy within the walls of a very real social cage. And then there were the Troubadors were poet-musicians, mostly from Occitania, who roamed from court to court performing lyrical poetry. Their songs praised beauty, suffering, devotion. Some became famous: Bernard, the Bentadorn, Arnaut Daniel. They wrote in Occitan, not Latin, which made their work more accessible to a wider audience of nobles and educated listeners. Their themes were surprisingly consistent: love from afar, the cruelty of an indifferent lady, the agony of desire, the joy of suffering. Love, in this literature, was almost never fulfilled. That wasn't the point. The point was yearning, and this yearning became fashionable by the late 12th and 13th centuries. Courts across Europe, especially in France, Italy, and England, were imitating the style. Eleanor of Aquitaine, a major political figure and cultural patron, helped spread courtly ideals through her courts in Poitiers and later England. Her daughter, Marie de Champagne, presided over one of the most famous centers of courtly culture. Even King Richard the Lionheart composed songs in the courtly tradition. So did many of his knights. Being a warrior did not exclude you from being a poet. In fact, the ideal knight was both a killer on the battlefield and a gentle admirer in the halls. That duality was the essence of chivalric romance. Chivalry, as a code, developed alongside courtly love. It combined military virtue with Christian piety and courtly manners. A chivalrous knight was expected to be brave, honorable, loyal to his lord, protective of the weak, and devoted to a lady. Not necessarily his wife, just a lady. Romance is fictional tales of knightly adventures from this culture. These stories, unlike the actual practices of courtly love, often did include dragons, giants, quests, and occasionally some very impractical armor. Chrétien de Troyes, a 12th century poet, wrote some of the most influential Arthurian romances. His stories about Lancelot, Guinevere, Percival, and the Holy Grail blended Christian allegory with romantic longing. Lancelot's love for Queen Guinevere was a perfect example of courtly love, passionate, forbidden, and ultimately tragic. These tales were not historical. They were idealized fantasies, but they shaped medieval imagination and still do. Much of what we think of as knightly behavior, from honor duels to damsels in distress, comes from these romances, not from real life. And yet, the influence was real. Young noblemen were expected to study these stories. They were taught not just swordplay and riding, but manners, poetry, and the correct way to speak to a lady. Courtly love became part of the education of elites, not just as a pastime, but as a performance of social identity. Still, there were critics, clerics, often frowned upon courtly love. It was too sensual, too worldly. It emphasized earthly affection over divine devotion. The church preferred love aimed upward toward God. Lust, even poetic, was dangerous, and many practical people saw the rituals as wasteful. Why devote your energy to sighing and verse when there were crops to manage and borders to defend? Even writers like Chaucer gently mocked the form. His Canterbury Tales includes parodies of courtly love, showing how easily the language of devotion could become cliché, and yet it endured, because it served a purpose. It allowed people, as those trapped by duty and expectation, space to express emotion, even if that emotion was stylized, even if it never led to anything real. Courtly love was like a mask worn to survive the rigidity of medieval life. It told men to be tender. It told women they were worth worship. It told a cold, violent world that beauty and sorrow mattered, even if only in verse. But did anyone ever actually fall in love this way? That's hard to say. Most of the evidence we have comes from literature, not diaries or letters, and even when real feelings may have stirred. Behind the ritual, the consequences were always complicated. A lady caught in a real affair risked everything: her marriage, her property, even her life. A knight distracted by love might lose favor, or worse, fall into scandal. So most of the time, it stayed fictional. A sigh, a glance, a poem, and that was enough. But what happened when courtly love met reality? When longing crossed the line into action? And what does it tell us about how people balanced love, duty, and survival in a world of castles, contracts, and carefully managed appearances? Courtly love was almost always extramarital, not necessarily adulterous, but outside the formal boundaries of marriage. It operated in the cracks between affection and duty. A noble woman could be the focus of a knight's longing without ever returning his affections. That wasn't failure. That was the point. The pain of loving someone unattainable was the engine of the entire tradition. But there were risks, especially when the emotions became more than performative. Marriage among the nobility was a matter of property, lineage, and alliance. Love rarely entered into it. A woman's marriage was arranged to serve her family's political interests. If she engaged in a real affair, it could mean dishonor for her husband, loss of land or reputation, even imprisonment or death. In this context, courtly love was a form of controlled rebellion, a safe outlet for emotional expression in a world that had little patience for romantic individualism. Yet sometimes, the performance tipped into something less symbolic. Take the case of Abelard and Say, a 12th century scholar and his brilliant young student. Their relationship began in secret letters passed, secret meetings, and eventually led to Say becoming pregnant. Abelard was castrated by Say's angry family. She was sent to a convent, he to a monastery. Their subsequent letters are some of the most emotionally intense documents of the medieval period, full of longing, regret, theology, and memory. Their story was not courtly love in the strictest sense, but it revealed the dangers of transgressive affection in a world bound by rules. Then there's Lancelot and Guinevere. Fictional, yes, but written to reflect the very real tensions between desire and duty. Lancelot, the perfect knight. Guinevere, the noble queen. Their love, doomed from the start, destroys Arthur's Round Table, the most ordered, chivalric world ever imagined. These stories served as both fantasies and warnings. They allowed readers to feel the thrill of love, and also the inevitability of its consequences. Love was elevated but always dangerous. The noble courts of Europe were filled with whispered stories, some true, some imagined, of knights and ladies engaged in long correspondences, exchanged glances, maybe even secret meetings. But the line between acceptable courtly love and scandal was thin. A flirtation could enhance a woman's social standing, make her seem desirable, worthy of poetic praise, but a misstep could end in disgrace. And so the rituals were careful. Letters were written in formal, coded language. Poems praised not the body, but the soul. Gestures were symbolic, the dropping of a handkerchief, the lending of a favor. The language of love became a language of symbols, safe enough to deny, clear enough to imply. You can think of it as a kind of emotional chess game, played with high stakes and long silences. And it wasn't just nobles who participated. By the 14th century, the ideals of courtly love had filtered downward into the merchant classes, into the literature of the time. Love manuals, conduct books, and poetry collections circulated widely. The imagery was imitated, diluted, transformed. Love became not just a noble game, but a social performance across Europe. But while the literature of courtly love flourished, real marriage remained a different matter entirely. Marriage in the medieval period was largely a contract. For peasants, it might be a matter of land, livestock, and labor. For nobles, it was diplomacy. The church increasingly insisted on mutual consent, but in practice, families still arranged most matches. The idea of marrying for love was rare and often seen as reckless. Courtly love offered a dream version of romance, intense, poetic, tragic. Marriage offered something else: stability, children, economic continuity. The two rarely overlapped. This gap between ideal and reality is one reason why courtly love stories so often end in sorrow. Tristan and Isolde drink a love potion and fall hopelessly for each other. But their affair ends in tragedy. Their love is deep, poetic, absolute, and incompatible with the social structures around them. Even fictional couples who survive don't always find happiness. In medieval literature, love fulfilled often becomes love ruined. The highest love is unconsummated. It lives best in longing, not in domesticity. That tells you something about how medieval people understood emotion. Real love was risky, dangerous, so the safest love was often the one that never happened. This tension also shaped the development of chivalry, the knightly code that governed behavior on and off the battlefield. A knight was expected to show deference to ladies, protect the weak, serve his lord loyally, and maintain his honor. Courtly love was woven into this fabric. A knight's devotion to a lady was part of what made him noble. But real life was more complicated. Knights were often brutal, raiding, looting, fighting in dynastic wars. The same man who composed a sonnet for his lady might burn a village in his lord's name the next day. The ideals of chivalry and courtly love offered a kind of narrative shield, a way to civilize violence with beauty. And that's part of what makes this history so strange. Courtly love didn't soften the world, just gave it a gentler mask. The real Middle Ages were full of plague, famine, war, and injustice. But inside that world, people carved out spaces for beauty, for poetry, for longing, for a vision of love that, while often impossible, still gave shape to their emotional lives. Even the church, which often resisted the sensual overtones of courtly love, eventually found ways to adapt. Marian devotion worship of the Virgin Mary borrowed heavily from the language of love. Mary was praised as a perfect lady, chaste, distant, yet full of grace. Hymns to Mary echoed the poems of troubadours. The secular and sacred blurred, and then, slowly, things changed. The Renaissance brought new ideas about individuality, romance, and emotion. Marriage began to be reimagined as a union of hearts, not just families. Literature shifted, too. Shakespeare's lovers, bold, impulsive, doomed, felt different from the composed lovers of earlier centuries. Romeo and Juliet were reckless, not restrained. Still, echoes of courtly love persisted. You see it in the romantic novel, in the idea of a crush from afar, in the trope of unrequited love, in the cultural fascination with longing. Even today, love songs are full of yearning. The idea that love hurts, that true love must suffer, that's a legacy of the courtly tradition. And what about the women? Courtly love gave them cultural power, but rarely real power. A noblewoman might receive poems, but she still lived in a world governed by male authority. Her real choices were limited. Her social safety depended on reputation. Her body, legally, often belonged to her husband. But in poetry and story, she could be something more. A sovereign of hearts, a guiding star, a queen whose glance could inspire. That contradiction remains. Between the symbolic and the real, between love and structure, between the world we write about and the one we live in. And so you wonder, did all that poetry make people feel more alive, more alone? Did courtly love give them hope? Or did it remind them, constantly, of what they couldn't have? What happens when a world filled with rules allows just enough space for dreams and then punishes those who follow them too far? The hall is empty now. The pages have been sent to bed. The fire burns low. In the candlelight, the knight writes one final line of verse, a poem, not for his wife, not for God, but for the lady who will never read it. He folds it carefully, tucks it into a book, and walks away. Courtly love was a ritual, a language, a fiction that people lived inside, even as they knew it wasn't real. But what makes it fascinating is not whether it succeeded, it's the fact that people tried to build something beautiful inside the limits of a rigid world. And now, as we close the story, we look at what remains, not just in the medieval past, but in the long echo of culture that followed by the late Middle Ages. The ideas of courtly love and chivalry were being questioned. The 100 Years' War, the Black Death, and the growing power of centralized states shifted the landscape. The knight, as a cultural figure, began to fade. The professional soldier replaced the poetic warrior. War became more brutal, less ceremonial. Armor changed. So did values. Courtly love began to look outdated. Writers like Geoffrey Chaucer and Boccaccio gently mocked its excesses. Chaucer's Troilus and Chryside is filled with irony. The hero spends pages sighing and suffering, only to be crushed by fate. The Canterbury Tales include bawdy stories that poke fun at the high-flown pretensions of noble lovers. And then came Christine de Pizan. She was one of the first professional female writers in Europe, a widow, a scholar, and an observer of her own time. In the Book of the City of Ladies 1405, she challenged the way women were portrayed in literature, especially in courtly tales. Why, she asked, were women always the object, never the subject? Why were they always beautiful, never powerful? Her voice reminds us that not everyone accepted the romantic framework they inherited. Some questioned, some rewrote, and yet Even as courtly love was critiqued, it continued to shape the imagination. Think of the 15th century Burgundian place of lavish pageants, tournaments, and poetry competitions. Knights rode beneath silk banners. Ladies awarded prizes to the most elegant orator. It was more theatre than reality, but people loved it. Or look at the Tudor court of Henry VIII. Music, poetry, flirtation, it was all part of court life. Henry himself composed songs in the tradition of courtly love. His second wife, Anne Boleyn, was a skilled player in this game, witty, educated, elusive. Their flirtation was filled with coded messages, glances, and calculated restraint. It ended, famously, in execution, which is to say, the gap between courtly love and real politics could still be deadly, but the dream lived on. In literature, in song, in paintings, the Renaissance added new dimensions. Petrarchan love poetry, with its idealization of an unattainable beloved, echoed the courtly tradition. Shakespeare gave us lovers who quoted poetry, who played with language, but he also gave us endings, some tragic, some farcical, some realistic. Romeo and Juliet were very much in love, but they were also very young, very impulsive, and very dead by Act V. Still, they became the new model. Passionate, doomed, brave. Love became something to pursue, to risk everything for, and that, too, traces back to the rituals of medieval courtship. Over time, the elements of courtly love were absorbed into the broader idea of romantic love, the devoted lover, the symbolic token, the ache of distance, the lover's suffering, the knight who fights for a lady's favor, the poem written in secret. Even today, we echo these tropes. Valentine's cards, promises to love someone forever. The idea that real love must hurt a little. That longing is proof of depth, and yet our modern understanding of love is more fluid, more personal. We imagine relationships based on mutual affection, equality, shared values. We don't often talk about devotion to someone who can never love us back. That part, perhaps, we finally let go of, but pieces of the medieval structure remain. You hear it in music lyrics, see it in films. The idea of the pining lover, the dream of perfect romance, the fantasy of the one true love who transforms everything. Courtly love never truly died. It just changed clothes. And perhaps the most enduring legacy is this: the belief that love deserves language, that it must be written, sung, remembered, that it is worth the effort even if it fails, even if it remains entirely in the imagination. Now, imagine, for a moment, one of those old manuscripts. Its pages are made of parchment, thick and yellowed. The ink is brown with age. The handwriting is uneven, careful, winding along the margins. There is a poem addressed to a lady who died 600 years ago. No one knows who she was. No one knows who wrote the poem. But the words remain, full of yearning, full of beauty, full of longing so precisely articulated it still moves you, even now. That's the strange power of courtly love. Not that it was practical, or even especially kind, but that it gave voice to emotion. In a world where so much was arranged, dictated, or endured, this one thing, this poetry offered space for the unspoken, even if no one listened, even if it never changed a thing. So now, as the night folds his last poem and disappears into the dark, you're left with a quiet question. Was courtly love a lie that made people feel alive, a truth they could only whisper? And if we still sing about love centuries later, Does it matter that the first songs were never meant to be answered?